Well, good morning. Good to know, I want to say see you, but good to know that you're here with us this morning. If you're listening to us on podcast or watching this video, I would want to welcome you. And I want to let you know that you can join us here and find us for your studies in the future at JCBN. Today, on the class is more like a fill-in class for me, for our people in Jamesport, since I'm currently at this Sunday attending a Bible lectureship in Powderly, Texas. I want to talk a little bit about Paul's preaching on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. And we'll start a class on that here pretty soon. It talks about the resurrection again there in 1 Corinthians 15. I know you've heard it for years. When you start to study and understand the prophets, not long ago I studied in really trying to understand the prophets the way that Paul and the Christians and Jews back in those days would have understood those prophets and what they were saying. And once you know about the prophets and understand the voices of the prophets, you're going to see the Old Testament basis for a lot of the language that's contained there in 1 Corinthians. Also in other places in Matthew 24 and all of it discourse. You'll see it there, the way they teach it. The way it's taught by Paul. And all this language that I've looked at and studied, like Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, and this area, basic about national judgment. That's what it's about. It's about national judgments. God had carried out those judgments on various nations under that old umbrella, under old covenant Israel. And so this language, if you will, that we see about all this language about fire, brimstone, burning, weeping, and gnashing of teeth, and destruction, and moons, bloods, all of this stuff, all of this language, should I say, is about the old system. It's a national judgment language. That's what I think it is. As I study, it was never used, listen to me, never used of a universal, global, whole wide universe judgment of any time or end of time of anything like that. It's not here. And you see the same thing in 2 Peter 3 about the burning planets and the burn up the earth. It's the same national judgment. Go over to 2 Peter 3 and you see all this planet burning judgment, the end of time, people say, and what's going to happen. The truth is, once you start seeing just a couple of things about that chapter, you have to come to the conclusion that Peter foretold not the destruction of a planet and a solar system of stars and real moons, but the destruction of Jerusalem. Destruction of that old covenant people, the old heaven, the old earth, that old system. Because first of all, if you look at Peter, we live under a different heaven and a different earth than Noah did back then, according to Peter. But, hello, we still live under the same planets and stars as they did, even though they say we're in a different heaven and earth in the Bible. So you have to realize the term heavens and earth. What's the term heavens and earth to the prophets? It's not being used of a planet and stars and solar system. So when you really understand elements, not to mean molecules and all this scientific jargon stuff, because it means the basics of the Mosaic Law throughout the New Testament. So if you're not studied up on the Old Testament, if you're not studied up on the old, under the old, then your lack of Old Testament background of what Peter's prophecy and terminology there is, then you're going to be led to an improper interpretation. An improper interpretation. A lot of us have seen the same thing with our modern view of hell, endless torment that we looked at in the last few weeks. So if you go back and listen to those teachings on hell and endless torments, I prove and show very plainly that that popular concept is Roman Catholic doctrine. And it was foolishly borrowed from them and molded into the Bible. From them, and of course the pagans, it was all borrowed, and the Islamic doctrine. It's just all molded in there. And none of that stuff, listen, none of that stuff is taught in the Old or New Testaments. I bared it out and showed you it's not there. So, when we see how many of the terms traditionally used to describe hell, as we did the last few weeks, are used in the Old Testament, we realize, we come to realization, don't we? Come to a knowledge we're lacking. In what, preacher? We're lacking in Old Testament knowledge. That's the problem. Understanding the voice of the prophets. That's the problem. Understanding it like Paul did. We don't do it if we look at it our way. And of course, the same thing can be said with the subject of marriage, divorce, remarriage, Sermon on the Mount, premillennialism. A lot of those topics that are New Testament with Old Testament background. What's the Old Testament background? I was taught growing up, well, the New Testament's what you live under, Mike. The Old Testament's just there for just a history book for us to look at. We really didn't study it that much. The New Testament, we're under that now. But that Old Testament, it's there like a history book or something. When actually, that's what we should have been studying and knowing what that said first on all these subjects, and have the background through the Old Testament. Now, I realize that a lot have done the same thing with the resurrection. When you get into the resurrection, that's taught here in 1 Corinthians, the chapter 15. There's something I pulled from a Robert West, and he wrote this, and I'm going to quote it. There were some light given in the Old Testament on the afterlife, Daniel 12:2, Micaiah 4:1. He says, but the doctrine of the resurrection, he says, life and immortality, which Christ taught, were new, he said. And he goes on to say the words resurrection, immortality are not in the Old Testament. He said in the King James Version of the American Standard Version, unquote. That's from William Robert West. Immortality of the Resurrection, page 94 and 2006. So, you see these authors here. This guy. He's only basic. What he's saying there is what most of the futurists believe. And what we believe for years in the Church of Christ, the subject of the resurrection is predominantly or exclusively only New Testament subject. It's only New Testament. And I believe this. I believed it for years. Don't feel bad. I believed it for years. 40 years I believed it. But now, understand when you find fulfillment, understand that we Christians, in fulfillment, of course, we simply can't understand Paul's teaching on resurrection without understanding the Apostle Paul's concept of the hope of Israel from the Old Testament. Can't y'all see that? And some argue with you, I know. Well, Mike, you're just doing this backwards. We use the New Testament, interpret the Old Testament, not the Old interpret the New, Mike. I said, growing up, we use the New Testament, interpret a lot of the Old, but that's not right. If you think you can take our modern concept of resurrection, the way we have it in our minds, molded in most people out here, if you think you can take that and read it back into the prophets, if you deal with the prophets at all, you have to consider how admirable the Bereans were as they studied things in Acts 17. Chapter 11, they were more nobler. They were searching things out. That's what we have to do. You've got to do that. I've got to do that. And those scriptures that those Bereans sat there and examined and tested was Paul's teaching. Were of what? New doctrine? No, they were of Old Testament scriptures. They knew those, weren't they? That's what they knew. So they compared what Paul's telling them to the Old Testament. They compared it to the Old, to what they knew. And by doing that, they saw that Paul's teaching was true. So it couldn't be the other way around. They didn't read our modern popular Dr. so-and-so concept of Paul's teaching on resurrection back into their Old Testament. They didn't do that. If they'd done that, their approach would have been just exactly backwards like ours, like all the futurists. Here's an example. A lot of passages in the book of Acts that tell us Paul, he went out preaching in all the synagogues on the Sabbath. And when he was preaching there, he persuaded those Jews, and persuaded them from what? The Scripture. Acts 14:19 tells us that. Acts 18:4. A lot of other places. So, what would have happened if they asked Paul, how can you give meanings to Hosea, Paul, Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Paul, that they didn't give us? You see? How can you give it to us, Paul? And if Paul responded, Holy Spirit gave me this fresher, newer, more fuller idea that isn't in the prophets. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you really think that his Jewish audience at that time, in the already but not, those Jewish audience would have accepted Paul's new teaching? Hello? I think they wouldn't. No way. No way. And you ought to see that too. They'd have sent him, they'd probably killed him or sent him on down the road. So what you're going to see if you study this is that Paul told those Jews on the resurrection that he taught nothing but what Moses and the prophets said would come to pass. That's what he was telling them. Nothing but what Moses and the prophets said was going to happen. Okay. How could Paul, who said, if he's given some newer revelation on the resurrection of a futures type, and then was contained in their Old Testament scriptures, they wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't have either if I was them. They knew that Old Testament. They knew it like the back of their hand, most of them. And so listen to me, guys. Until you realize how Paul and the Berean Jews used that Old Testament scripture, you're not going to be able to understand 1 Corinthians 15. You won't do it. That's a hint. That's true. And you're not going to learn it unless you know what the prophets are saying here about the church, the body. And that's the purpose. That's why I'm giving this lesson here, is in an opening to an Old Testament background of Paul's teaching of the hope of Israel, that old covenant Israel, and the hope of that resurrection of that body, the church, okay? So here's a clue for you. Paul quoted, he quoted Isaiah 25:8, Hosea 13:14. over here in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54 through 55. Have you noticed that? Look at the Bible. So, I didn't notice it for years. Not in that way, not in that light. I really didn't notice it most of my life. Even though I stood right up there and taught 1 Corinthians many times, taught it the way I learned it in school, the way they tell it. And I've taught it several times that way. But when you first notice that fact, it's just simple, and you ought to notice it. And when you notice, you go, I was on the phone the other day with Steve Basden, and we were going over some of these scriptures, and I go, wow, okay, here we go again, Mike. Now I got to go back and see what the Old Testament is teaching about the resurrection. Now I need to go find that out. And if you haven't had it, you need that same experience. You need to say, now I need to go back and see what it's talking about, what we're discussing here. You have the aha moment. So a lot of the people just don't know what they're talking about. They have something in their mind. They were taught. That's the way they figured it into the Bible. And it's the New Testament, the new way. So you could be a good person and do it and teach wrongly, but we all did it one time or another. We all believed it that way. Future Church Christ people, all of us, on the subjects. Even like the one that I just discussed and quoted over the resurrection of Israel in the Old Testament, okay? So we need to consider and we need to think about some Bible teaching on the resurrection outside. Before you look at 1 Corinthians 15, I think you need to look at Bible teaching outside the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Let's begin with, and I think it'd be good to begin with in Acts. Yeah, Acts. Y'all remember Apostle Paul's teaching and Paul's paying for the vows of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And afterwards, remember, he was mobbed. That's over in Acts chapter 21, verses 27 and 28. Look at that. The Jews from Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the multitude and laid hands upon him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law, and this place. And moreover, he brought Greeks into the temple and have defiled this holy place." Wow. Of course, none of those charges they were laying on him was true, was it? Paul made it clear in his defense before Felix and Agrippa. Acts 24:14-15. After the way which they so serve I the God of our fathers, he says, believing all things which are according to the law, and which are written in the prophets, he says, having hope toward God, which these also themselves look for, that there shall be about to be, in other words, a resurrection both of the just and the unjust. So, what's going on here, I believe, with the Jews accusing Paul, the Apostle Paul, with his preaching on the resurrection? Was it not based on 1 Corinthians 15, but based on the law and the prophets? It's based on the law and the prophets, whether they believe Jesus or not. What did Paul say to Agrippa over in Acts chapter 26, verses 6-8? And now I stand here to be judged for the hope of the promise made of God to our fathers, and to which promise our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. And concerning this hope I am accused by the Jews. O king, why is it judged incredible with you if God hath raised the dead? Now, this is what I noticed in verse 21 through 23. He's explained further his preaching on the resurrection. Look at that, 21-23. Having therefore obtained the help that is from God, I stand unto this day testifying both the small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses did say should come, how that Christ must suffer, and how that he first, by the resurrection of the dead, should proclaim light both to the people and to the Gentiles. Okay, well, let's go to another final passage. Acts 28:20. Look at that. Acts 20. His Jewish audience, Paul said this. For this cause, therefore, did I entreat you to see and to speak with me, for because of the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. So, think about this. Think about this. Paul said that when he preached the gospel, he taught the hope of Israel on the resurrection, saying nothing but what Moses and the prophets taught. Can y'all see that? That was also the very reason that he was put in prison. So, here's the problem. When Paul, preached the hope of Israel, and he was in the Old Testament teaching of the resurrection that we're talking about, the people took it as an attack on the Jews, attack on the law, an attack on the temple, attack on all them. Why? Why? What's the connection? Why would they do that, preacher? Well, like I said before, I preached on 1 Corinthians 15 a lot of times. No one accused me of attacking the Jews. Have they you? No one accused me of attacking the law. Nobody's accused me of attacking the temple, attacking anybody. Why? What's the connection? Could it possibly be that we haven't preached the hope of the resurrection from Moses and the prophets like Paul did in the same way? But that's the gospel he preached. That's exactly the disconnect between our teaching and this camp and Paul's on the hope of the resurrection. Night and day. Paul's concept of the resurrection wasn't fleshly bodies would be booming up out of holes in the ground. Because that's not what Moses and the prophets taught. Y'all see this? It's easy, really, when you see it. I don't know about you, but I've never heard a sermon on the hope and the resurrection from the Old Testament. Have you? And I haven't heard it. Ever, never, ever. Have you ever preached on one? If you're a preacher, anybody taught on one out there? Well, let me say this again. If you're listening, hello. Until we understand the Old Testament teachings, the prophets, and the voices of the Old Testament on the resurrection, we're never going to interpret 1 Corinthians 15 the way we should. It's that simple. Makes sense. We're never going to teach like Paul taught on that subject, and we're never going to get the reaction from the audience that he got. Yeah, it's all important to realize Paul had already written 1 Corinthians 15 when he made those statements over there in Acts. So, over here in 1 Corinthians 15 has to be based on nothing else but Moses and the prophets as well. Well, we can sit here today, people out here, these futurists out here today believe all kinds of things taught on 1 Corinthians 15. That can't be found in Moses and the prophets. It won't be found. It's not there. That Old Testament under the old umbrella foretold the resurrection quite a lot of times. And it's not, listen to me, it's not the popular view of fleshly bodies booming up out of the ground and coming out of holes. Nothing like that. But a whole lot about the resurrection of Israel. The body. How Israel would die. How Israel would be planted like a seed. How Israel would be resurrected and transformed. How Israel would come up. in that body. That's why Paul could quote his conclusion of 1 Corinthians 15 from Isaiah 25 and from Hosea 13, which we're soon going to study and see, were to be fulfilled when Jerusalem and the temple and that old system, that old heaven and old earth were destroyed. So, it's truly sad. The word resurrection is not in the Old Testament. But we have inadvertently ignoring a lot of plain teaching from the prophets on the very subject of resurrection. If you don't listen to the voice of the prophets, what about language like Isaiah saying of God in Isaiah 25, 6 through 9? And Paul quoted it in 1 Corinthians 15:54. That God would what? Swallow up death for all time. Well, what about Hosea in 8th century BC, contemporary BC Isaiah, Hosea 6 and 12, saying, "Come and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will receive us. And on the third day he will what? Raise us up," he says, "that we may live in his sight." Raise them up, that body up. One body, the body of believers. You see? And Hosea over there also, as God saying of Israel in Hosea 13:4, "Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your thorns? O shoals, where's your sting?" And verse 1, Hosea said that Israel was dead through Baal, their idols. And it referred to their spiritual death, not their biological bodies and biological death. There are more parallels, I believe, between Hosea and 1 Corinthians than you can ever see. The whole context of Hosea is behind 1 Corinthians 15, I believe, and it's made more likely when we realize that many of Paul's points can be found in the book of Hosea. Like what, Mike? Well, like sowing, planting of Israel. 1 and 4, Hosea, first child by his harlot wife was named Jezreel. God sows, God's seed in the earth. Chapter 2 and verse 23, Israel buys. Chapter 1 and verse 5. Harvest appointed through Judah, chapter 6, verse 11. And when? The resurrection, chapter 13, verse 14. Quoted is about to be fulfilled. It's fixing to happen, 1 Corinthians 15:55. David what? Ruling on his throne, chapter 3, 4 through 5. First fruits of what? Israel, chapter 9, verse 10. God becomes their king, chapter 13:10. Ezekiel 37 also refers to the death of Israel. And God told them, "Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, that you may come to life." So that word resurrection isn't there, of course, as some say, but that word, or I'd say the process where Israel was dead and God's purpose was to bring them, that body, back to life. You see, Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 through 27, what he was told in Daniel. Jesus quoted from the passage earlier in Matthew 24 we talked about, indicating it would be fulfilled in that generation. So I'm going to get into a study about 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection, but this is an opening. And you need to see these things. So I want you to look at it in the light of prophets. Look at it in the light of the Old Testament. Nothing future day about it. It's about Israel in those times back then. And it was a voice of the prophets that you have to understand and see it. And to understand what it's really talking about. I'm going to leave you with that. That's going to be my time on this lesson. I appreciate your attention. We'll take up 1 Corinthians 15 and on the resurrection, hopefully the next lesson. If you're listening to us or if you're watching us on video, we appreciate it. Go and find the next tape and sermon, the same place you found this one. And may God bless you and keep you in your studies and join us again. Thanks again for listening.